Professor Karandikar, Dr. Garg, Geeta Singh Rathore, and ladies and gentlemen, let me thank MOSPI for having invited me here. I think Dr. Garg just said, thank you for the kind introduction. I think Dr. Garg just said from the introduction, you realize there are several things you have supposedly done which you have not done. Inaugural address sounds like a very fancy expression. I look at the people, particularly seated in the first row, and I wonder what is possibly the value addition I can impart. We've got Vishwanath Golder, we've got Sunalde Desai, we've got Anant Nageshwaran, we've got TCA Anant, we've got Praveen Srivastav, and we've got Shamika Ravi. They should be the ones who should be speaking, as I'm sure they will. Our role in this inaugural session is really that of flower pots. And the sooner we get out of the way and it moves over to the technical sessions, the better it is. We have been reminded about the first NSS round in 1950-51. That was a different era. The limited point I want to make is in the 1950s, early 1950s, certainly throughout the 1950s, the Indian statistical system was one that was recognized and applauded throughout the world. It stood out in comparison to the statistical systems in many countries of the world. Dr. Garg mentioned, since January 2024, we are now members of the UN Statistical opportunity to take a re-look at the Indian statistical system. The Indian statistical system has been criticized. It's been criticized by people outside the government system. It's even been criticized by people within the government system. And there are several reasons for these criticisms. Some of those pertain to quality. Some of them pertain to time lags. And a little bit certainly is due to the fact that users do not understand what MOSPI is up to. So historically, MOSPI has not been very good in communicating to the rest of the world what it has done and why it has done it. And therefore I congratulate Professor Karandikar and Dr. Garg for having started this series of user conferences. Sometimes the criticism that emanates is valid, in which case, as Professor Karandikar said, to the extent possible it should be taken on board. Sometimes the criticism that emanates is misinformed, ill-informed, which is why these user conferences are important. When we particularly come to the Consumer Expenditure Survey, the fact sheet has been available for some time. The unit level data have also been available for a few days now. So the way I look at it is, as has been said, this particular session today is an opportunity to ask questions about what has been done and why it has been done. There are some standard perennial issues about household expenditure surveys like these. A few of those are sort of red herrings, meaning the debate over those is sterile. One of those is the aggregate of consumption expenditure and the gap between that and consumption expenditure as defined by national income accounts. That's an issue that plagues every country in the world. To my mind, that's a bit of a sterile debate. A second kind of debate is about inequality as defined in the distribution of personal incomes. Officially, we do not collect data on the distribution of incomes. NCAR does it, but we don't, officially. And there are very valid reasons for that, and it is of course a fact that inequality as measured by the distribution of incomes will be a little bit higher than inequality as measured by the distribution of consumption expenditure. So we come to this particular round of consumption expenditure. Whenever there are improvements in sampling design, in questions asked, and I think a couple of days ago, T.C. Anant wrote a very vigorous defense of the new methodology in MINT. Whenever there are improvements, there is an issue. Improvements are desirable, but improvements make any particular survey non-comparable with the earlier one. And in this particular one, the earlier one is 2011-12, which means we've been waiting for a very, very long time. On the face of it, and I'm asking this question deliberately, on the face of it, is it a good thing that the Gini coefficient has declined? We seem to take it for granted that it is necessarily a good thing. Depends, of course, on the level of the Gini coefficient. But we all know that as economies grow and prosper, inequality tends to widen a little bit. We are not talking about Gini coefficients in the neighborhood of 0.6. We're talking about Gini coefficients that are in the neighborhood of 0.32 and 0.34. The second question I am asking this deliberately is, given the kind of churn that is happening in India, does the aggregate Gini coefficient tell us anything at all? Or should we begin to look at Gini coefficients separately for different states, which of course the Consumption Expenditure Survey enables us to do? Should we in fact not even look only at Gini coefficients but look at the Lawrence curves? Because my impression is that the shapes of the Lawrence curves and the changing shapes of the Lawrence curves are much more revealing than purely the Gini coefficient. The next issue, which has nothing to do with MOSPI directly, is not an inequality issue, at least inequality instead of using data from 2011-12 and using it in the World Inequality Report, which routinely gets quoted everywhere. But the side issue is that of poverty, which is not really as MOSPI's domain. We still do not have an official poverty line that goes beyond Tendulkar. There was Rangarajan, but it was never officially accepted, and the MDPI is not quite a poverty line. So the question to ask is, should we now have a new poverty line to which These data can be applied, and by the way, these data not only, as has been mentioned, are not only about inequality and poverty, but they also function as inputs in various other cases. So let me congratulate finally once again Professor Karandikar and Dr. Garg for having organized this. The methodology will be debated. I know my colleague Shamika Ravi is taking a very close look at the methodology you have used, and it is quite possible that we may end up criticizing, which is perfectly desirable. MOSPI for a very long time was described as the Ministry of Status Quo and Perpetual Impediments. I am delighted that with Professor Karandikar and Dr. Garg, MOSPI is changing. At the beginning we had Vakratundaya Dhimahi, Vakratunda Vinayak is sometimes a Bigna Karta and sometimes he is a Bigna Harta. I am glad that MOSPI is moving on from being a Bigna Karta to being a Bigna Harta. Thank you very much.